we on? Good. Welcome to the Better Than Not podcast. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But when we at least do something, we know it's almost always better than not. Hi there, and welcome to Better Than Not, the podcast that aims to capture shifting perspectives and thought-provoking ideas in conversation, which is based loosely on my Substack series, A Changing Frame of Reference, which you can read on the Substack app, and I hope you will, as it might give you some insight into what this podcast is all about. I'm your host of Better Than Not, and today, Doug Gardam, and today it's a privilege and I'm quite excited to welcome Dr. Michael Butler from the University of Saskatchewan. Michael, how are you today?
Not too bad. Thank you for having me on.
It's really a special pleasure for me to have you on today because a lot of the things that we discuss about here kind of revolve around science and then kind of move into things biblical, the ancient text of the Bible, and even God. And this is a great conversation. I'm looking forward to this conversation because of your background as a scientist, an astrophysicist, and your specialty being in quantum gravity, which, not to scare the people listening, we will go through this, but I think you'll find that it'll be done in a very understandable way from Mike. So that's kind of where we're going to start. I met Michael very fortunately at the recent apologetics conference here in Abbotsford, and I was immediately attracted because with my background in science and engineering, I'm always fascinated how science is brought, not only bringing forth scripture, but also talking about God and the demonstration thereof. So I really thought it'd be great to have someone on that brings this together. So that kind of brings me, Mike, to the first kind of question around it is, where did this start for you? Was it for me, this has been a revelation of the last, I'll say 10 to 15 years, so to speak. But you've gone deeply into this as far as education goes. And where did this kind of start for you? Were you raised in a particularly, I'll say, a Christian home, or were you raised in a science home? How did it all kind of come together for you at the beginning?
I was raised in a Christian home, and science was seen very positively. I remember being encouraged to pursue science, and we'd go to the library and get space books, and I'd spend hours going through those. So I had sort of both worlds, I guess. But when I hit post-secondary, I started running into a lot of people who had very negative things to say about religion. And so I wanted answers to that, right? Were they
Mhm.
right? And is there more to this? Because on the surface, you have these people who are very knowledgeable, people I would otherwise respect, right? And so I took their opinions seriously. And I just wanted to find out for myself. And so that's where my journey started.
Do you have a particular memory of what kind of first kind of like prompted that kind of thinking that shall we say science, the whole science and God thing are connected and not separate?
I think that came later.
Okay, okay.
So I think with my education, I started looking at, science, computer science, logic, philosophy, things like that.
Mhm.
Um, but it was only after I had some of those pieces in place and I was starting to connect the dots, right? You start
Uh,
learning about like metaphysics and you realize, our foundations of knowledge and things in epistemology are also really important to science, and how we view reality is important for science, and the dots just started sort of connecting themselves at that point. And then you start listening to others like John Lennox.
yes.
Really pushes this point, and so seeing it all connected, that's sort of where it came. But that was probably closer to my grad school years.
I'm glad to hear you say that because for me, this was something that took a long time to kind of start to begin to gel. And it was specific questions that started to arise. You mentioned John Lennox, Dr. John Lennox, the mathematician from Oxford. And I've talked about him previously also on the podcast, but the whole mathematical idea of the intelligibility of the universe and how that all fits together, how would I say, perfectly
Yeah.
without any human intervention is really the question, the comment that I would have there. Was that something that began to really kind of get your thinking going when you started to see how like this all fits together?
Yeah, well, and especially coming from physics, because you spend so long just getting the fundamentals in place. But
Mm.
there's a point, especially in grad school, where you start looking at things from the context of, say, symmetry or group theory, where you start piecing together these fundamentals, and you realize they're all connected, right?
Hmm.
And they're
Hmm.
all related to each other. And whether you have a symmetry might mean you have conservation of energy or not, right? And there's all these mathematical formalisms that you can sort of construct, and you can sort of compare theories that way as well, right? So
Hmm.
two theories can be very different on the surface, but you see that maybe they're very similar, or the other way around. And so from a physics point of view, it just took a while because there's so many other things to get in place before you start dealing with those ideas.
I think to me that's a good point because it does take a while to start to bring some of the theories together. Because I think of, and someone I think it was this was taken from another scientist, but I think Eric Metaxas, who actually wrote the Bonhoeffer biography, had broken this down. And the example I have, this is kind of why I wanted to share this with you and see how you looked at this. But back in the 60s, Carl Sagan, cosmologist, very famous, but he said that to have life, you needed a star and a planet a certain distance from the star. And that's where life could start. And so we suddenly say, we're not alone here. There's got to be extraterrestrial life in the universe. Let's go start looking for it. That's only 50 years ago. And now those parameters, I understand, have grown beyond like 200. Like there are just so many of them, which you would be able to bring about through this physics perspective. Can you comment on that? Like, was that something that started to turn things, or was that he just kind of like the lightning rod that brought a lot to, or a lot of attention to that kind of took science away from that connection with, shall we say, ancient text and even the Bible and what it tells us?
Maybe partially. I don't know if that was sort of the sole thing on its own.
Okay.
Um, but I think, especially starting in, say, the 50s or so, science sort of took off and it was able to answer a lot of things.
Hmm.
And I think just in that potential to answer questions is where you see a lot of that erosion. And so Carl Sagan's point, I think, does contribute to that because it's answering one of the big questions, like how did we get here, right?
Right. Right.
And so I think that's important. But there was just this momentum in science, right? And it's just ability to explain. And I think people started putting a lot more faith in that than, say, religion.
Do you think in that way, like as an example, this is something I repeated over and over. We have really nothing to do with being created ourselves, right? Like we appear here, but it's not out of our own, shall we say, ability to do so. And when we start going down that science road, we have these things like, well, AI is going to become sentient and control the world as a big statement, right? But we tend to forget very quickly, to me, that I mean, we can't create water without pulling it from something else. We can't even create the simplest molecule on the periodic table like hydrogen. Yet we're going to jump into something like this that could create something like us. Could you expand? Do you think you could, like expand on that a little bit as far as how that fits in? Because to me, physics has a lot to do with this, and then it's just it's not it just doesn't seem to be possible.
Yeah, I don't know if I've thought about this point in depth. So I will say, just to begin with the AI point, that
Yes.
also doesn't start from nothing because you
No.
need huge amounts of data generated by us to make it generate data that looks like it's made by us,
Hmm.
right? So um, I think that that is sort of a fundamental truth, where you need something to have something in
Okay.
this universe, right?
Hmm.
Um, I think once you get outside of the physical universe, maybe that question opens up. But um, yeah, from a physics perspective, you're always starting with something, right? And even in cases where it might look like you're starting with nothing and then getting something, say pair
Yes.
production, there's still a background field, right? There's still energies at play, and there's something there with a description. And what I usually say is that nothing doesn't have a description, right? Other than it doesn't have a description, right?
Yeah.
So,
It's
so
nothing.
yeah, so if it has values and it has equations describing it, it's not nothing. Yeah, so um, yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question,
Well,
but
it's kind of like a discussion subject to me. This is one of the things that I kind of find interesting because I think that this whole idea of I call it sentience or sentient, the ability to reason and think. Like this is, and um, to me, it's not so scary that it will become that because I think we're limited like as far as what we can actually create. That's why I go to hydrogen atom. We can't do that. But if we believe that it can, to me, that can be very disruptive, concerning, if you
yeah,
follow what I mean. Like it's
y-
not that it can, but if we believe that it can.
yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Like, I don't think it's going to get there on its own, but we might put it in that place ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And the thing with AI is that it probably can get close enough that, from the outside, it looks very human-like.
Right.
Um, but whether you actually assign that value to it, I mean, that's very much a human activity, right? We're
Yes.
the
Yeah.
ones who assign values to things. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I think at the end of the day, it'll be us who put it on that pedestal. It's not going to climb up there on its own.
Right. Right. Do you think a lot of the thinking of where we're at today kind of stems from I'll call it the Enlightenment of like the 18th century and the beginning to kind of reason for ourselves? I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but
No, that's fine.
do you think that has started a lot of that? Like, is really where we became like, well, I think Nietzsche was to say there is no God, right? Or something to that effect, or God is dead. Um, do you think enlightenment kind of started to bring that forward that like we were in control of our own destinies? We are in control of, and science is what's going to be the almost the force that allows us to learn that. Because
I
you're in
think
the science world. That's the reason why I'm asking that.
I think to some extent, but a lot of that thinking, to the best of my knowledge, existed in some form previously, but it was coupled with theology, right? Your philosophy and your theology were sort of hand in hand at that
Together.
point.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so I think that marks the point where they were separated, right? And
Okay.
sort of
Okay.
where you can walk alone with this idea that you can reason for yourself and independently. And so sort of the foundations that theology may have brought were sort of left behind.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. 'Cause some of this kind of started to where this really started to, I'll say, buzz around in my head. Are you familiar with the author Stephen C. Meyer?
A little bit.
He wrote a book called Darwin's Doubt, and he talked about the Cambrian explosion in that book. And surprisingly, I just didn't recognize that he said like that broke the evolutionary theory because 500 million years ago there was this explosion of life that there's no pre-fossilization for. And he said that Darwin knew about it. And the reason why I kind of bring it up, because it was another one of these things that kind of just rabbit holes that you go down that I'd never heard of before. And I started to put that together with the idea that, okay, well, if there's a hole here and that life was there, How does that start to give us a different thinking about how we were created, as an example,
Yeah, so I'm not too familiar with that part of
right?
with the fossil record. Um, I mean, part of the challenge with those things as scientists is there can be so many variables at play, right? And so, if you go back into the distant past where, you didn't have the organisms required to break down, say, wood, right? They couldn't break down cellulose.
Right.
Well, you have, just layers and layers of basically carbohydrates being deposited into the earth. And that's where, most of our coal and our oil come from.
Mm,
Right. And so those kinds of factors can drastically change how fossilization occurs, right?
yes,
And
yes.
what product you get. So you don't want to necessarily look at an absence and think that has an explanation outside of science, right?
Right, right.
And I say that only because I want to avoid that usual complaint of a God of the gaps sort of solution, right?
Right
Because
on. Yes,
people really like to jump on that one.
yes.
Um, but I think it's interesting too that science doesn't necessarily have all the answers, right? And
Yeah, yeah.
not necessarily in this case, but there are limits to science, right? And
Yes.
understanding where those limits are is really important when you're trying to put scientific information or scientific conclusions in context. So,
Well, it's funny when you prompted that about the petroleum, you made me think of Dr. Hugh Ross and his thinking of that the universe was created for us, and he uses that example that you just described. He says the fossilization and decomposition of that Cambrian explosion animal are what we today, it was provided timing wise for us to use as our major energy source today around the world. Which, like, when I heard that, Mike, it was like, oh my goodness, we need both. Like, to your point just now, like, science needs to help us demonstrate what we're learning in these ancient texts that have so much to tell us, that and much of what we're still trying to interpret and understand.
yeah, well, and to that point, like much of the modern era, right, the Industrial Revolution wouldn't have happened without these, fuel sources being in the ground. We'd still be burning whale oil, assuming we
Oh,
hadn't,
yeah.
fished them to extinction. So it's interesting that our state is very much dependent on what came before, and a lot of it's on a knife's edge, right? And
Yes.
it seems very specific. And you look at other extinction events too, like they happened at key moments right when, say, mammals were ready to take off, right? And it happened in a way that affected all the other species, negatively, far more than mammals, right? And
Right.
it's interesting.
Oh yeah, no, it's so this kind of gets me now back to yourself. What is it that kind of drives you in, I'll say, your research, your idea, like, I bridge the gap already around quantum gravity, and your interest, well, it's more than an interest, your study with regards to astrophysicists and bringing the that cosmos together. Like, what kind of drove you, and is there a, like, a deep and an inner sense of, like, connect with where we came from that brings some of that together too?
I think so to some extent. My area doesn't look at the past so much. A lot of it is looking at the cosmos, right, and trying
Mhm.
to make sense of things out there. But I think there's a beauty to a lot of these theories, even the ones that are probably wrong. There's so much to explore just mathematically, and we know the mathematics is really good at explaining things, or at least approximating things.
Right.
And so there is a certain satisfaction in seeing, a set of equations describe something incredibly complex, right? And doing it very well, and just seeing it all fall together, and potentially even understanding maybe how some of the things are working behind the scenes, things you can't see yet. right? And that's really where the theoretical part of my research came into play for me, just because you can sort of, peek behind the curtains and see potentially what's going on behind the scenes.
And that's what, when did when did you realize that kind of motivated you? When you, like, do you remember the first time that you could see behind the curtain, that was revealed with, like, the mathematics of a certain part of what you were studying?
I'd say probably the first research problem I did, right? So where I didn't have guidance.
Okay.
It was the first problem where I had to take what I knew and try and find a solution, and seeing that all come together after a lot of work and a lot of headache, but finally got there, and knowing that I could take everything I'd learned before and put it together and then use that to explore new problems, right? And potentially see something that someone else hadn't seen before.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So is that kind of what led you into this idea of, and I was going to say, we put a title to things like quantum gravity. Is that what kind of led you to this idea? Like, because I'm interested in the idea of quantum gravity. I mean, we've got the quantum physics perspective, and most of us have heard of gravity and its impact, even though, as I read and read, the more and more I read, it seems that we know less and less about gravity than many think we know. And you're kind of bringing those two, because I think there's a lot of insight that comes from the quantum world into, I'll say, connecting with this spiritual world that the ancients seem to have some glimmer into. You used the word metaphysics before, that we may not have had explanation for, but there was some kind of understanding about it.
Yeah, I don't know if it was that specifically, but quantum gravity is one of the sort of last big questions of
Okay.
physics that we know about, right? And I think that's what appealed to me, is it's very much the unknown,
Okay.
to the point that we don't even know if we need a theory of quantum gravity, right?
Interesting.
Right, because we know our theory of quantum physics, right? Those models don't necessarily work when there's lots of gravity around, and we know that gravity doesn't necessarily work when you need to do quantum physics at the same time. Um, but that might just be a problem with those theories, right? And so naturally, based off of everything we've seen before, right, especially when it comes to symmetry, and we've learned how all of these different theories relate to each other and connect mathematically, we were just naturally inclined to say, well, let's stick them together somehow, right? And
Of
um,
course.
we don't know if that's right. So
So, Mike, I'm going to pause here for just a second. Could you give I know it's a difficult one, but a simplified ideal for some of the listeners about quantum physics? Like, people have a picture of what gravity is. It's what holds us to the ground, so to speak. When quantum physics, I mean, was early in I think the 20th century that started to come about. Could you put that into, I'll say, layman's terms, but, like, in a simplified of what is quantum physics for a person who's just trying to understand where we're at in this discussion?
yeah, so with quantum physics, we realize that when we are trying to determine certain things on small scales, right, so like electrons and particles, they didn't behave how we thought they would, right?
Mm.
They aren't these point particles that we expected them to be. And what we also realized is that their behavior wasn't purely deterministic, right? There wasn't one outcome based off of one set of initial conditions. And
Mm.
so quantum mechanics is dealing with the fact that there are more than one outcome for a lot of these different kinds of measurements we do, right? It's all very statistical. And being able to account for that mathematically required sort of a completely different type of model in physics. And so that's sort of where it began. And now quantum mechanics can mean a lot of different things depending on the context, but it's ultimately a description of very small and trying to deal with the fact that small things don't behave the way things that we interact with in our everyday lives do.
So when you thanks for that. When you started to see this and become this is where for me these questions start to come together. Like the cosmos is one thing because I think of that as like the heavens, right? It's like way out there. But when we go to the other side, to the subatomic level, to the area you're studying with quantum physics, um, it seems like we just keep going. Like there's more to uncover and to understand. So when I think of when you say quantum physics, I think the idea here is um, if I was going to assemble something and there were 5 steps to assemble something, I do those 5 steps and I get whatever I finish with, a wheel, let's put it. I've got a wheel. And every time I do those 4 steps with those 4 things, I get a wheel. What I'm trying to give an example here of like the quantum physics as you described it. What you found though is when you go to this subatomic level, this with atoms, you can have those 5 steps, but it's not always the same result that comes out.
Yeah, and so you potentially have to track multiple results, right? And to be clear, we do know what the possible results are, right?
Yes.
We
Yeah.
we can sort of constrain it. We can put limits on it. Um, but you don't want to necessarily have to do the math or follow the 5 steps, say 15 times to explore all the options,
Right.
right? And so a lot of the formalism in quantum mechanics is just reducing it back to 5 steps. But when you get to the last step, you just sort of get your 15 outputs, right?
Right. Right.
So on the surface it looks fairly simple on like you still got your 5 steps, but
Right.
what you're doing is very statistical. There's lots of different paths to follow. um, and yeah, it's a different way of thinking about things. um, and that's not even getting at sort of the weirdness you can sort of start exploring when you realize what it is you're actually trying to describe and why you get multiple results, right? there's
Yes.
there's there's
Yes.
a lot, and that gets into philosophy as well. Like if you look at the interpretations of quantum mechanics, a lot of them are split along ontological and epistemological lines, not physical ones,
Right.
right? And so it's very much philosophy and metaphysics.
Which to me begins that connection again. That's there. So now I go back to something else that I kind of known about, and this is actually came out of the same book of Darwin's Doubt, but they termed it as methodological naturalism, which is when Darwin's theory came out. We kind of the science world kind of went that if it's not natural, if it's not a physical thing, we're not going to evaluate it. So metaphysical kind of gets thrown out the window because it's not natural, or I call it material.
Mhm.
And when I started reading, like again, Mike, I was so surprised. Like, how do I not know some of these things? Have I not heard them in my engineering science world? And it's like, okay, this is fair. Can you comment on that a little bit as far as because you're already bridging the gap when you've talked about metaphysics already?
um, can you summarize that question for me a bit?
Yeah.
Just
I know there's a lot there. I think what I was trying to say is unless you could see it as in a material thing, we started to say, or science started to say, if it's kind of a non-material nature or spiritual, I'm kind of throwing that into the metaphysical world. We're not going to look at it. We're going to only study things that are materialistic. And I was kind of surprised when I heard it, but I also saw that as saying, okay, and you already mentioned this earlier on when we talked about the Enlightenment time, but this is where I've been using the term God, but it's the spiritual world being separated from science. And I feel now that we're actually coming back together again, to be honest, which is a follow-up question. But that's what I was. Have you seen in your work that would kind of say, yeah, that is what's happened, Or no, I don't see it quite that way.
So I guess there's sort of two answers there.
Oh, okay,
Um,
good.
One is it's really important to know your limits of the science, right? So
Oh, right.
if the science doesn't apply to something,
Yes.
then it's just not the right tool. So you take something like miracles, right?
Yes. Oh my goodness.
Miracles can be defined a few different ways, but they're usually these one-off events, right? They're not repeatable, they're not reproducible,
Yes.
and they are out of the ordinary because of it, right? And for science, you typically want to be able to explain what it
Mm.
is. That
Yes.
doesn't apply, and you want to be able to reproduce the experiment, right?
Yeah.
And measure it multiple times, and that doesn't apply either. And so, is it the right tool for exploring miracles? Maybe in some instances, maybe not, right? And so there's that part of it. On the other hand, I'd say from a theorist point of view, right, and that's much closer to what I'm doing research wise, we're very comfortable with ideas that you can't directly test, right? And parts
Okay.
of our models that may represent a part of reality, but we don't know. All we know is that we need them there to properly describe
Mhm.
everything else. So the example I like to use is one area of quantum field theory is electrochromodynamics,
Whoa.
and it has a concept called color, right?
Okay.
And so
Yeah.
as things are interacting, you would expect certain results. But we realize that some of these things that are interacting have a property called color, or what we call color,
Right.
and you have to track it for you to be able to predict the right things because it wasn't always happening, right? So you might have one result and you'd redo the experiment and you wouldn't see it again. You'd see something else and it didn't make sense. But if you assign color to all of these things and you build up the system of how colors mix and interact, it works, right? And that's the chromodynamics part of the
Okay.
electrochromodynamics.
Oh
But
wow.
we don't know what color is, to the best of my knowledge anyway. That's
Right.
not my area, but it's a part of the model that's important for us to be able to make proper predictions. And so
Interesting.
there's those things throughout theoretical science, right? Where you have things in the model, maybe they're part of reality, maybe they're not, right? And you don't want to assume they are. Um, but there clearly is some feature of reality that's there, that's associated with those things, right? And so
Right.
in those cases, yes, science can describe something that, might not be quite physical to the best of our current knowledge.
And when you kind of saying that, it's very easy for a layperson to generalize.
Very
And
much
and
so. Yeah.
it's almost like the enemy of science in a way, because we walk away with a certain generalized idea of something, and it can be very wrong, but there's enough there to make us think that it's right. I think is part of the question. But it's interesting that you talked about color, because I've had a number of this is a bit off, Mike, so I'll start off warning you. But because this, I was going to say, I love the philosophy and we talk theology, but there's a psychology stuff that kind of fits into this, and oh well. But there's this condition. I don't know whether it's a condition, but that it's called synesthesia,
Hmm.
and people can see things and like a taste, but it be in a color. And when you describe that, what like you're giving one of this, well, I don't know whether solutions is the right problem, but you're giving it a color. It was kind of interesting of how, and we don't know what color is necessarily. It was interesting that you brought that up, that that's actually being used in science in trying to solve a particular problem. Like you called it
Uh,
chromium,
Electrochromodynamics.
electro. Okay,
ECD for short. You may have
okay.
seen ECD mentioned, but yeah, it's a particular branch of quantum field theory.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting to me of how this color starts to fit into some of these things. So, you started to get interested in this idea of quantum gravity. How did like that start to break apart for you to say like, okay, this is where I'm going to study?
Um, I ended up with the supervisor I did, right? And
Oh,
so
Okay.
My first research experience at the end of undergrad, you're assigned somebody in the department, and they'll give you an actual research project to work on,
Okay. Yes.
and it was related to an area called holography. Um, that takes a little while to explain, but basically it is one way of looking at quantum gravity. Um,
So
and based
is when you say holography, is that related to a like a holograph?
kind of.
Okay.
So the idea is that you can represent space mathematically
Hmm.
in the area of a sphere, right? And so the idea is that you sort of partition space into ever increasingly smaller bits, right? And so as you get towards the outside, you're going towards infinity because
Right.
each small piece is the same size inside locally. But mathematically, you have this finite sphere or disk that you can look at. And what happens is that when you get to infinity, well, you don't have gravity there anymore, right? There's no curvature. And so you can do all of your normal physics there, right? And so because it's a surface, right, it's one dimension lower, just like a hologram is, right? It conveys a three-dimensional image, but in two dimensions. If you think of like a
Yep.
holographic sticker or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can do all your normal physics there on the outside, and then in the bulk, you can still have all your gravitational physics. And so the idea is that you can explore systems using this theory where you have both your gravity and your quantum field, um, and see how maybe they describe the same system but in different ways.
Kind of one with gravity and one without gravity.
Yeah, and it's all in the same model.
Wow.
It has its limitations, but yeah, that was the first experience I had, and yeah, it went from there. So
Interesting. So now, if I bring this back now a little bit to what we kind of started with, and I think I termed it a Christian home, but you were familiar with, I'll say, Scripture, the Bible, and you do talks around science and the Bible. How did that become like? Did you feel like you were an outsider with that perspective when you started, or did you find a lot of commonness with other scientists? How did that start to formulate for you when you were like, okay, there's a lot of connection here, like, and how come I see it but others don't?
uh, that's an interesting question. I think partially I never really ran into any issues.
Oh, okay,
But
interesting.
I think that's a Canadian culture thing to some extent,
Oh,
where
okay.
from at a professional level, academics don't really talk religion,
Hmm.
um, unless that happens to be their profession. But what I found is, people I'd been working with or had been taught by for years were Christians, right? And you'd never know, other than maybe one or two of them would drop the odd hint here or there. Um,
Interesting.
but outside of that context, I'd say there's a fair number of scientists who hold similar beliefs, um, or are at least open to religion, right? Maybe they're not on board, but they don't
Okay.
really have an issue with it, right? And they see them as sort of separate things. Um, but no, I haven't really had too much conflict personally. Um, Honestly, I probably got more pushback from students,
Okay.
during my academic career than anything else, and even that wasn't too bad. So
So this kind of leads me to your connection with Apologetics Canada and speaking for them, because you are clearly bringing the science perspective to this, which, I mean, it's almost part of the apologetics perspective, right? When you think about it, is trying to bring, shall we say, meaning and understanding to Scripture and to the Bible. How did you get connected with apologetics in that sense?
the same way we did, I went to their conference a few years
Oh,
back,
oh,
and
really?
had a chat with Andy, and it went from there. So
Oh, interesting. So, because when you mentioned that, Andy's been on the podcast here, and he has some very interesting perspective because he's very, I'll say, science oriented,
yeah,
and this is kind of the part that started to really appeal to me. was this, because in trying to figure this, I'll say it's just like a kid's question, right? Like, why are we here? How did this come about? And I'll go to like Galatians 4:7, the peace of God surpasses all understanding. Because there's a sense that we're not going to be able to understand it. But it doesn't stop the pursuit, Mike, if you understand what I mean, right?
Yeah.
And well, just it's like, do you ever get dazed? You say, "There's so much here. How am I possibly going to ever understand it all?"
Very much so, especially with quantum gravity, because you need to know your quantum physics really well, and you need to know your gravitational physics very well, and those are usually separate domains,
Yeah, that's
right?
gigantic, though.
Yeah, and then I also did computational physics in parts of solving my problems, and so there's a computer science aspect, and then you've
Oh
got the
my goodness.
numerical theory too. So yeah, well, yes. So short answer, I definitely felt there's too much here to know, um, but also learning that it's okay not to know things.
Yes,
And I
yes.
think that was something I really struggled with at the start because I'm going to be an expert, right? I'm going to know all of
Mm,
this, and
yes.
you hit grad school and you're like, I'm not going to know all of this, but I'm going to know this piece that I'm researching, right?
Right.
So
Interesting, because it makes me lead to I think Einstein's given the quote, but I'm learning more and more about less and less until soon I'll know everything about nothing. And but again, it doesn't. One of the things I find interesting with it is it doesn't stop this pursuit, and this is where it comes back now to the artificial intelligence question. I'm beginning to find that AI is extremely helpful in the things that I don't necessarily do well. And what I mean by that, I'll give you a simple, and that's why that's my question to you is, are you finding tools from AI helping you in your research? The example I'll give though is, um, when you're doing a paper, or you're doing, or you're asking, someone's asking you a question for what was this all about. I find AI incredibly useful for being able to explain it. So, like, I'll go to a thing. If I'm reading something out of the Bible, so let's say reading something like the Sermon on the Mount, and if I ask, as an example today, if I ask Grok that, it can come back and tell me better than I could ever summarize it. It seems what it's about. That's useful to me because that's what I find it very difficult summarizing things in that sense. Do you find AI in your world, if you even use it, but is it particularly applicable to things when you're doing research, or that enables you to do things that otherwise would be very difficult to do?
yeah, so to some extent, actually, the topic I got involved with AC Apologetics Canada with
Okay.
was AI, and it's what I speak on or what I spoke on first with them.
Oh,
So
you did.
yeah,
Okay. I missed that one.
yeah, I didn't advertise it, but yeah, I studied machine learning in part of my grad school because
Interesting.
it's very computational related, so I was very interested in it. For my own research, I've used machine learning in general.
Okay.
So when people say AI, these days they're usually
Yes.
thinking of a large language model, right? Something like
Yes.
ChatGPT.
Right. Right.
Um, but there's other ways where algorithms can sort of learn. And when you're solving problems numerically, you might have variables that you kind of know what value they need to be, but you don't know exactly, right?
Okay.
But
Yes.
but there is an exact value that exists, and you need to find it, right? And sometimes those variables aren't just like a straight line, right? You can't just try them all.
Right.
You have to optimize where the value lands, given all the other parameters you're testing, right? And maybe it depends on a lot of other things too. And AI is really good at that, right? And so modern AI is built off of this idea called gradient descent. Um,
Can you
and
expand on that a little bit?
so if you've got like this curve, right,
Yeah.
and you want to know where the minimum is, right?
Okay.
You can try every single value, right, to try and find that minimum. But gradient descent is a way to sort of identify minimums in an
Oh, okay.
intelligent way. And AI does a lot of this, right, across lots of parameters, right? Large language models are billions of parameters, but you can do it for fewer, right? And
Okay.
so there's other ways of doing machine learning that are based off of this concept. And it's really useful for that, where instead of me manually punching in 1.01, 1.02, right,
Right.
and trying to find something intelligently or, looping through them, um, this can cut down my time to like 10% of the original of just random guessing or brute
Oh, wow.
forcing. So it's really beneficial there. For explanations, I like it when it is a domain I am familiar with, right? So if
Okay.
I've written
Yes.
something complex and I want to reduce it down to a nice summary, it's great because I can review it, I know it's right, and I
Yeah.
can make corrections and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I've asked it questions in my domain, and the big ones like ChatGPT and stuff, and it gets really basic details wrong. So,
Interesting. I like
an
that. Okay.
example,
Yeah.
in general relativity, Einstein's equations are the ones that we use for
Right.
describing gravity, and
Hmm.
it's got a couple terms in it. One is called the Riemann tensor, or the
Okay.
Ricci tensor, I guess, technically. And then there's also the Ricci scalar,
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
right? Now, all three of those actually are represented by capital R's, and they're all related to each other very closely. And I found that when I ask for explanations for concepts related to them or Einstein's equations, it mixes them up, right? It'll
In-
get the equations right, but what it calls which one, it gets wrong. And the
oh, wow.
reason
Okay.
is that machine learning is very statistical, right? And
Hmm.
so all of these symbols are very closely related. They all show up with very similar frequencies,
Right.
and they're all derived from each other. And so it's very hard for models to distinguish something like that unless you give it specific examples that do exactly that. Right. And so with AI, there's this problem where it's really good when the details don't matter. Right. So if I want it to generate any story about a princess in a castle, great.
Hmm.
If I give it 1,000 criteria the story needs, not so great, because it's probably going to
Mm.
mix up some of them.
Right.
If I need a summary of a book, but it doesn't really matter which parts of the book it summarizes, it's fine. But if I need it to capture any mentions of, say 100 specific topics or terms, not so great, right?
Interesting. No,
And
this is really cool.
yeah, and so I think AI is great and it's a useful tool and I use it, but you have to be aware of when it's going to work for you
Its
and
limitations.
where it's going to be reliable. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, it gets more reliable every day, right? And there's a whole industry where you just have humans going through outputs that they've generated or users have submitted and checking them for consistency, and they'll make up new training data to do corrections in the next version, stuff like that. Um, but it's still fundamentally connected to the statistics of the data.
Right.
Um, Back when I took machine learning, the usual example that they used was um, facial recognition, right?
Okay.
And people with darker complexions don't do very well with facial
Mm.
recognition, especially early models.
Right.
And part of that was the data sets were coming from the US. And if you look at the population distribution of, people with darker complexions versus people with,
Yeah.
lighter complexions, it's like 80% one and only 20%, with darker complexions. And that weights the model, right?
Right.
That
Absolutely.
biases the model.
Absolutely.
And so you have to make corrections for those kinds of things. And so there's a lot of human involvement, and it works well where it's been tested,
Yes.
and but if you're using it for um, edge cases, or again where the details really matter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Because I often think that I'm going to go back years now. I mean, we still have Wikipedia here, but when Wikipedia first, because I can remember when it first came out, and everybody just laughed at it, like, yeah, if you want to get a wrong answer, just go there. But what I don't think we understood was how mass input could affect an answer. And with it being open for people to go in, sure, they're going to be wrong answers, but there's more people interacting with this that are going to correct it. And so I always thought of it as thinking it's going to converge on the truth rather than become worse. It would just get better. So I'm giving this example, Mike, because others have kind of said to me, like, you can't really use that. And I kind of like, I'm asking you, like, is that kind of what we're evolving from now? Like, but like, that's the kind of like, it's because that was mass data that we really hadn't had prior to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And massive input from different areas. And like, to me now, I mean, of course, we're going to AI most of the time, but there's a lot of people that use Wikipedia now to find specific answers that they're looking for because it's true. It's proved itself, I think, to be somewhat reliable. Correct me if I'm wrong, though.
Yeah, so I can, I can speak to physics articles, at least
Yes.
on Wikipedia, and
Yeah,
those
that'd be
are
great.
all the mainstream ones, like the main topics. Like if you look up electromagnetism, right?
Okay.
Huge topic, well reviewed, lots of experts contributed to its to the page. But if you look at something really niche, right, you're
Ah,
looking
there
at
you go.
a very specific space time. You don't know who necessarily wrote that.
Right.
It may have only had one person look at the
Yes.
article at any given
Yes.
time. And so what I actually like using Wikipedia for is finding sources, right? And so I just go
Okay.
straight to the bottom and look to see what it referenced. And then I start looking at the references and see what it was connected to. And
Interesting.
often for main articles at least, you'll
Yeah.
find good textbooks, you'll find articles, usually primary papers on topics if it's scientific. So if there's sort of like key papers that were
Right.
in the field, you'll usually be able to track them down that way. So um, I find that more useful. But I mean, I'm also looking at it as a scientist. So
Yeah,
um,
it's a very different, like,
yeah,
I think your example is really good because I mean you're picking something that, like when you said electromagnetism, right? Like it's something that, oh, I think it's one of the four fundamental forces, right? But for someone that's not in that world, you could go there and get an accurate description of what it was or a definition of what it was, and you could count on that. Um, but if you're going to your say something that's much more niche, you now don't have that input, that mass input up and down, right and wrong, that's that will converge on a right answer. But and again, it comes back to this time thing, right? Like because now I think I would say AI models are replacing the Wikipedia world. No?
to some extent, yeah. But they also suffer from the same problem because
Mm,
the data it learns from isn't always completely independent.
mm,
And so if you're asking it about one specific thing and it's not well represented in the training data, just like the Wikipedia article on the niche topic,
right.
you potentially have it trying to
Yeah.
fill in the gaps based off of closely related things.
Yes.
And sometimes, especially for very detail orientated topics like science, that's wrong, right? You wouldn't mix them in that specific domain. And so I think there's a challenge there because it it does converge to truth, just like a bunch of humans writing Wikipedia articles typically will.
Right.
But it also doesn't have a clear distinction when you've moved into that niche topic. Because the
Okay.
niche
Yeah.
topic might have a really short page. It's not well cited. And you can go and you can look at the history of how it was edited, and there's like one person on it and it hasn't been reviewed or changed since. Right? There's those kinds of indicators.
Yes.
But AI will present it like an expert would, right? With the confidence an expert would.
And you can't tell.
And you can't tell. And sometimes the sources it gives, like it might list sources because you can do that with a lot of the search tools now. But if you click
Interesting.
on them
Yeah.
and you look to see if it mentioned it, well, because it didn't have enough data to go by and it filled in its gaps based off of its learning, you'll find that the things it mentions aren't in any of the sources it gives. But it's been forced to give sources,
Right. Okay.
so it gives them. Yeah.
That's I was going to say that to me is something that I was not aware of, but it makes a lot of sense, like that it kind of follows in that similar suit.
Yeah, and so the usual adage people use from the AI world is confidently wrong, because it'll present its answer like it's the truth, even if it was low confidence, right? Um, it'll
Mm,
also pick up on things a little odd too, so you have to be careful with like prompts and stuff, because if you assume something in your prompt, say it's a loaded question,
right.
and again it hasn't been trained to not take that loaded question, it will assume that was correct, it'll run with that assumption, and it'll present it like it was true. So the example again that I use is earlier models of ChatGPT, which they've now fixed. But if you asked it, why is the Joker the hero of the Batman universe? Right. So it assumes
Yes, yes,
something. It'll
yes,
run
yes.
away with it, and it'll confidently try and answer you. They fixed that now, and it usually says something like, "Well, I'm not sure that's right, but here's some reasons you might think that." Right. So they've corrected it, but um,
Interesting.
yeah.
Okay, because
So so going back to this whole thing about converging on truth, you
yes.
have to be careful because the prompt injects certain things into the model, and
Hmm.
the data has its biases, and all of these things can interact, and even how you ask a question can change your answer. And so
Yeah.
yeah, it really depends on the truth aspect. You've got to be a bit careful, because if its answer doesn't matter too much for you, it's fine, right? If you're just sort of curious what the weather is, and if it's wrong, not
Right.
a big
Right.
deal. But if you're trying to get it to, explain like a complex topic that you then need to explain the next day,
Right.
that might be a little more serious, right? And you don't
Yeah.
necessarily
Yeah.
want to spread that information if it gets it wrong.
No. Well, I mean, especially if you're being seen as a person that would know, you want to make sure that that's the correct thing. But I've never thought of of your concept of what makes the Joker the hero in The Dark Knight, right? Like it's like if you asked your question in a different frame, assuming that that's what it was, it won't know, right? Like it doesn't. It just this is the part, Mike, to me, and that's why I mentioned the idea of AI becoming sentient. Is that like right now, when you ask like a Chat GPT or a Grok, well, even Google today, um, they're just answering that question from like a data set of information they have, right? It's not like me asking you a question that I've thought through, or you asking me a question that is more than just accumulation of, shall we say, tangible data. If you get what I mean, as I ask this question, I'm thinking of this because I'm thinking when we think, even is that something that can be represented in essence in a mathematical format?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting because AI, right now a lot of the attention is on these problem-solving models, right? And
Mm,
so
mm,
ChatGPT has their IO version, right?
yes.
But the way they force the model to do problem solving is in the background. You might ask it a question or give it a problem, but what they do is they structure the actual request to multiple steps. So they might be, what is the solution for this problem? And list all of your steps. Okay, you gave me step one. Is step one correct? Review step one and revise it, right? And this is all going on in the background, and it's prompting the model over and over and over again to refine the solution. And that's how they enforce it to do problem solving. But the structure of that is a human
Yes, yes.
manually putting in, a problem solving framework for it. It didn't arrive there on its own. It's not coming out of the structure of the model. It's being forced onto the model.
And you're raising a really, to me, important issue that we forget about this sentient comment is the fact that all of you, just what you've described, is still being controlled by a human.
Yeah.
which we forget very quickly, right? Because I mean, when you think of it, like even, and I'm not talking from the scientific standpoint here, but as a person who Googles something, you're kind of, you almost use the word, "Wow, is it ever smart?" Right?
Hmm.
It's like, no, it's just working off data that's been given to it. It's not like doing what you're doing when I ask you a question here, or vice versa, right? Like
Right.
that's, and so I'm branching a little bit away because this kind of to me starts to fall into consciousness, shall we say, maybe the unconscious. And I don't know whether this, you can comment on this, but I'm going to ask the question anyway because I haven't done this for a while, but I saw Sir Roger Penrose talking about the idea that with the unconscious, and he was throwing around the word consciousness with this, but he said, with science, physics, we have tools for physics, we have tools for biology, but he says we don't really have tools for the unconscious from a science perspective. Like he says, if we come up with a new science and able to do this, that could change things. And so why I'm asking this is, does this ever bridge into some of the scientific work that you're doing with regards to even quantum gravity? Like, does that ever, because there's a metaphysical element to it to me that I find kind of fascinating. And I'm not trying to put you in an awkward position. I'm very interested because you're in the science world. This is what you do, right? So it's kind of fun to find out, like, how does this get understood? I put a lot of stuff in there. I know, Mike.
No, that's okay. Um, so, well, first off, Roger Penrose is probably one of the greats in the field of astrophysics, and he's done work in
Mm.
areas that are very closely related to quantum gravity, if not parts of quantum gravity. Um, so I've read a lot of him, is what I'm saying.
Oh, cool. That's cool.
Yeah. And so his philosophy is that there's three worlds, right? And I'm assuming this is where his comments is coming from, right? So
Hmm.
there's the world of the mind, there's the physical world, and then there's the abstract world where mathematics and logic and things like that live, right?
Oh, I
And
like
these,
how that's split.
yeah, and so these worlds overlap, right, to some extent, right?
Sure.
And in the middle is the mind, effectively, right? Or, the mind is bridging these worlds together, at least for us humans. Um, so anyway, I just want to mention that because that's sort of an interesting viewpoint from such a well-known physicist. Um, but I
Yes.
think I think in astrophysics or quantum gravity or quantum mechanics, we try and avoid that to the best of our ability.
Okay. Okay. Good. Okay.
Um,
That's good to understand.
so, if you look at, say, the interpretation of quantum mechanics, right? And so that deals with not necessarily the mind, but metaphysics. The most common one is the Copenhagen interpretation. And it's basically the one that makes the fewest assumptions philosophically, right? We just
Hmm.
sort of treat it as it is, and we don't try and assume too much about the world and what all of these things in the model mean. So I think that's sort of the operating mindset most physicists approach it with, right? Where we try not to dive into the philosophy unless we really have to.
Okay.
Uh, Um, which, I mean, has pros and cons because on the one hand, science has its philosophical
Hmm.
foundations, and you need to
Hmm.
be aware of what those are to sort of utilize it properly and to its full extent. Um, but on the other hand, you don't want to necessarily present metaphysics or philosophy as something that has the tangible credibility of, say, something you've done physically, or an experiment that you've done. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes.
so I think that's where the motivation comes from, where we really don't want to present something that is different from what we normally do, right? Just a clear
And that would
distinction.
make sense. That would make sense because you run into the territory of not being able to explain something then that all the other work you've done is explainable, right? Like this is, to me, it's that bridging. So this is, I mean, it just caused me to, when you go into a lot of this, are there times when you're going through this that you kind of feel like, and I'm going to use the mind of God, but one of the big things that I find with with scripture in the Bible is it's so opposite to our world, in the sense that that whole thing, well, if you don't see it, don't believe it, right? It's done for protection. It's because so many people have been scammed or whatever. But when I look at the Bible, it's all about not seeing and believing. How does that connect, not necessarily with your work, Mike, but in your thinking when you're reviewing this? Because you're on, like, in many ways, from what you've described, you're on the edge of science. Does that ever bridge the gap there of this whole, like, getting into the, shall we say, the mind of God? I mean, this is kind of what John Lennox would often talk about I've heard him talk about in mathematics, the intelligibility of the universe and so on. Does that, and I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable position, by the way, because I know you have colleagues as well, but I'm just curious because I constantly find when I go down these rabbit holes of technology, of science, that they're kind of just opening a little bit of a scene behind the curtain, so to speak.
So to some extent, I think. I mean, going back to, say, color and ECG
Yes.
theory, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's something I've never seen, and it might not represent something that is physically tangible or testable, right? We don't know.
Right.
So I think there is some comfort with those ideas, right? And believing at least in the validity of something in the model, right? Maybe I don't believe it's a tangible part of reality, but it is, in an abstract sense, true and
Hmm.
real.
Hmm.
So I think when you're dealing with abstract concepts like mathematics, you get really comfortable with believing things that aren't tangible, right?
Okay. Yes.
Um, but in terms of more religious belief and biblical belief, I think it's a bit different there. But I'd also say that there's room for demonstration too, right? Where you'll go through a narrative and God, or a prophet or Christ, demonstrates something, right? They do miracles, right? They
Hmm.
prove something true.
Hmm.
So I think there's room for that too. Um, so I see. I'd really like to make a clear distinction between blind faith, which is
Oh,
not what
good.
I think biblical faith is,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I think faith is grounded in something true, and it is something that can be, you know, validated or proven through other means. Maybe not directly, but
Hmm.
you take it in whole, and certain things have to be true as a result. That kind of stuff.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, yeah, so I think that's probably where my answer lies. Somewhere in there is that, you know, I'm okay with that, both biblically and scientifically, because both require a certain faith of a kind, right?
Right. Right.
And I know that's not really a comfortable topic for some scientists, but you're believing that there is something true to be found in the first place, right? You're
Yes.
believing in the reliability of logic and mathematics to describe the thing. Um, and that's not stuff that's tangible that you can, do an experiment on, right? Because you have to
Right.
use those things to draw your conclusion in the first place. So, yeah, I think there is a sort of there's an overlap there, right? And I
Hmm.
think if you dig a bit into something like epistemology and understand how we try and ground our knowledge and the limitations that we run into, you realize that faith has sort of uh, a wide scope
Hmm.
to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. For sure. So this kind of brings me around to, and I want to think that you talked about this in the presentation I saw, but this could be my wanting and you not really having done. But one of the things that I had gotten down to was this whole idea of visible matter, invisible matter, dark matter. And this kind of fits into the question I was saying about science deciding to do work on what we can see, not on what we can't see. And that's a very general statement, I know, but just to kind of help separate the two. And one of the things that I've been reading a little bit about is the fact that the existence that we are in is like primarily like 95% dark matter and dark energy, and like a 5% number around what is visible. So when I mean that, I can touch the tire of my car, I can touch the desk, I can touch the tree that's in my backyard. That's visible matter. Um, and the stuff that's all in between it, or we even have a hard time describing it, is dark energy, dark matter, which makes up what I'll say. I don't even know whether this is the latest, Mike. It's just that I've heard, that I had been reading that it was 95% energy. Am I reading into something that you didn't talk about?
No, I think I do mention it briefly. Um, I don't remember the context. I'd have to double check my slides or my notes.
Well, the
Um,
reason why I'm bringing it up is because in my engineering world, I mean, one of the things I'm really glad we have the engineering world and science world because of the planes that I fly in and the cars we drive and the boats we ride in. Because without science and engineering, we would be on a wing and a prayer. Like, we don't want somebody getting real creative with the plane we're going to fly in tomorrow, right? Like, we're glad that we have the laws that we've learned and figured that out. But now I'm looking more almost an existential kind of existence perspective. And with the 5% of being material and 95% being dark matter, dark energy, do the things like that we've been talking about, whether it be metaphysics, whether it be consciousness, unconscious, even you describe, shall we say, light or miracles, does that fit into that non-visible form that makes up such a what we're hearing often from science, making up such a substantial part of the existence we are in? I know it's a big question, Mike, but I just sometimes I'm interested in how you think about these, and you're in the science world all the time, so
you know, so I think as a scientist, I would probably distinguish the two categories. Um, because for, whatever dark matter is or dark energy is, it's there because we've made a measurement and we can't account for it, right? So we have a value for all the visible matter,
yeah.
and we know how that should behave. And it looks like there's a lot of missing matter and a lot of missing energy in the universe, right? And so we just call those dark because we can't see them.
And that's a really good way to explain that. Yes.
Yeah, so it might be matter, right? It might be matter that just doesn't emit light, or it might be energy, but it could be a problem with our model, right?
Mm-hmm,
Or
mm-hmm,
maybe there's
mm-hmm.
something odd about where we are in the universe that changes our observations. Um,
Yeah.
right. So I mean, there's a lot of different factors that can come into play, but I guess it's somewhat similar if I'm looking at sort of my broader worldview, right? If I take off my scientist cap and put on my everyday cap, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, you can definitely, or I definitely see room for there being things that are not accounted for in sort of my everyday tangible experience, right? There's more there. And you could think of that as a variable representing the missing part, right? And
Mm-hmm.
maybe you call that supernatural or spiritual or whatever.
Right.
But there is something there. And I think most people are going to agree with it to some extent, right? They're going to maybe disagree on how big of a variable that is. But
Right.
you look at
Right.
something like morality,
Mm.
it's really difficult to ground morality in a physical world, right? It's
Yeah.
very much grounded on human values and what we think is important and what we think is right and wrong, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, on that extent, some people are going to agree, okay, yeah, there is going to be something more there. Or they're going to give room for the abstract and mathematics and logic and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, I guess it's an interesting point. And yeah, depending on which cap I'm wearing, I'd probably talk about them a bit differently. But
Do you think we're progressing in our understanding of it?
to which one?
Like the idea of this, when I say that, I'm bridging I guess I'm making a bit of an assumption here, but I'm kind of putting the dark energy, the invisible matter, the dark matter, the dark energy, and bringing that in with things like the unconscious. That, like, we go every night, when we fall asleep, we go, I think, into the unconscious, and we have to go there because we can't survive without sleep. We can't be in there, but we know so little about it. And I'm bridging the gap myself. I'm not putting those words in your mouth. I'm saying here we've got this big part of our existence that we can't explain through visible matter, as an example. And do you think we're progressing? And the follow up to that is, do you think that, um, like, ancient texts like the Bible can give us more insight into that?
So, in terms of progressing, I don't know if I
Yes.
would put it that way,
Okay.
but I would say we're getting more comfortable with those things being there, right?
Okay.
I
Okay.
think we've moved away from that sort of hardline naturalism, right? Or
Right. Right. Right.
that hard logical positivism where everything needs to be empirically demonstrated. Um, especially in physics, like we've moved away from it there. But I think
Mhm.
society is also now shifting towards it. And I'm not sure about you, but in my interactions, people are a bit more open to spiritual things than they were a few years ago.
I'm kind of blown away by it, Mike, to be quite honest. I mean, it's kind of in many ways where this whole podcast even came from. Like, some of it I'm feeling is experience. Like, you're growing older and you're learning more. But for most of my life, like, science was the answer. And then I found out that, well, it's not giving all the answers. And so, um, that's what bridged the gap. So I'm interrupting you there, but to your point, you asked whether, like, that's kind of what I'm starting to feel, and really over the last 10 years has been quite a change for me in how I think that way.
Yeah, it's been quite the shift. And then I think to the other part, well, it's difficult when you mention something like the unconscious or even the
Yes.
conscious. They're grounded and known through human experience, right? And so,
Mhm.
from a scientific point of view, it's really difficult to evaluate those things because we can't
Mm,
present an experience as evidence, right? We want to test something, we want to measure
right.
something, and those things aren't necessarily directly testable or measurable. I mean, we
No.
can measure the brain, but if you're assuming that brain activity is unconsciousness or lack thereof in that case, or brain activity is consciousness, you're making a leap that you haven't tested, right? You haven't measured,
Mm,
right? And the only way to know if something is affecting the conscious experience is to ask the person with the experience. So, just to say from a scientific point of view, I think it's really hard
yes.
to discuss that. Philosophically, I think people are a lot more open to this idea of exploring things related to minds and thought. And I say, maybe some of that shift from that naturalism to the spiritual has also gone that way, where people are more interested in their own minds and what their minds can do, and
Right.
how they view reality through their minds, things like that. I don't know again if that's progress, but it's definitely
Mm,
change.
yes. Yes, for sure. It would be changed. Do you notice this in the student world? Like, what so the reason why I'm bridging this a little bit is because it's, the Apologetics Canada connection. There's this discussion that I've had and had a few guests on talking about this, but this idea that, are you familiar with Justin Brierley?
Yeah, yeah, I've watched or listened to Unbelievable for years, so
Oh, you have. Okay, so you
yeah.
know about his book, The
Hmm.
Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And in talking with a few people from the UK, it's kind of exploding in the Gen Z world. Um, and I'm hearing this not only from I'll say kind of media sources, but I'm hearing this from boots on the ground. So individuals. And I'm wondering like how that might bridge the idea of like, well, because the common thing I'll hear will be, well, we had the internet, it was supposed to give us everything, and it's failed. We have social media, we're supposed to get everything on that, and it's failed. In fact, all these screens that we have around us now are not giving us what we believe. And there's the fuel part that, well, we don't know anything about this Bible that you're talking about. And even if I bring up the word Jesus, we don't even know what that's about. Could that, and this is kind of what I've heard a little bit more. So the reason why I'm asking you this is kind of from the university perspective. Have you noticed any of this? And whether you can even talk about it, like that, it's okay if you can't. I just, you're there and you're seeing, I would think you were seeing this, I'll say younger generation of what that's about, or whether you're seeing any of it in Canada.
So I haven't, but I would also say that when you're in STEM, people approach STEM very analytically, right?
Yes.
And so even
Yeah.
if it's there, it's not necessarily evident. But I bet you if you went to philosophy classes or history classes or things where you're talking more about like the human condition and where religion is more naturally going to come up, it's probably going to be evident there if it's there. So
Interesting. No, that would be probably true. When you say history as an example, I think of, I don't know whether you're familiar with Tom Holland's book Dominion.
I haven't read it, but yeah, I know of it.
Well, it's a super dense book. I'll tell you that
That's
right
why I
now.
haven't read it.
But
It's on my list though.
he's put together this whole, I'll say, like a lot's happened in the last 3,000 years, 2,000 since the Bible was produced. And he goes through all that in this book. And I'm probably 2/3 of the way through it, but I think I just can't believe what the, as an example, Mike, it's the, like he's saying how deeply embedded Christianity is in our world. And we forget that, like the date as an example.
Yeah.
Like we don't even think of that as a reminder, but that's where it came from, right? And so I don't know where I'm getting off that. I'm coming back to the science part as far as we're used, because I'm always interested in what's happening sometimes on the university campuses and that understanding, right? Because maybe things haven't been delivered as we thought they would. And I would hate to see science squashed in place of, you mentioned the term blind faith. Um, because I think both help. Like, and I think I'm an example of that. It's just these rabbit holes you go down, you wouldn't go down, you wouldn't understand that, that this is where that came from without it, without the, I'll say the context of what was written 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I'd say that's maybe my bigger concern today. When I started out, my issue was more pushing back against the hardline naturalism, right? The logical positivism.
Oh, interesting.
But now I think it's more important to, at least in some circles, to argue for where science works, right?
Hmm.
Because I think it had been overused or used outside of where it should have been, right? It was presented as a solve
Hmm.
all solution, right? And it isn't that. And I don't want it to be displaced because it was misused before, um, right? And
Right.
so I think we're approaching this point where we're going to have to start arguing for science's place, because I think there is a lot of focus on truth in the individual, right, and their experience and very subjective groundings. So, and science can sometimes brush up against that in ways
Yeah.
that aren't comfortable. So, yeah, I think there's going to be a shift. But like you said, I hope that we find balance, because that's what we needed in the beginning, right? There needs to be
Yeah.
room for science where it works, and then other aspects too, because truth is not just the domain of science, right?
No, and I think if I look at the early history of science, it was in balance with I'll call it God and religion. Like part of it was there to demonstrate it. And to your point, we see. I don't know whether, Mike, whether this is our way we are as humans, or whether this is the power of the media. But that old saying, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," we're really good at it. Like, okay, to your point is, and I to me, this is not a battle between, if you want to call it, spirituality. I don't like that term a lot, but um, the the belief in God versus science. That's not what, to me, this is about. It's about bridging that gap to say if it can help you understand it better, and that, like, we didn't create ourselves. This magnificent, perfect existence that we have, where everything fits together, we didn't have anything to do with, by and large. Because I look out the window and I look at the tree there, and it's like, we can't make a tree. We can plant a seed, but how do you, and you think of all the different flowers and the intricacy of the flower, and like, it just does, whether we're there or not. And yet science can help us to understand, to me, what that is, and open up both sides of it. So I'm glad to hear you say that, because I was going to say, you think that that could be a result of all this, is that science not giving us everything, so we're going to throw it out too.
I think so, and it's not even so much that it doesn't provide everything, but that it's going to come into conflict with things that we want that science says isn't correct or doesn't fit in with reality. And so I think part of this, and you were talking about human behavior and, sort of where this comes from, but I think we view everything through a human lens, and there's desires and motivations. And so I think sometimes it's just out of a desire for simplicity, right? If you try and keep
Mm-hmm.
both things, you have complexity there. Um, but something like this, yeah, I don't know. It's complicated, but yeah, I think you're right. It boils down to human behavior, right? Psychology to some extent, where we have our own desires that we're trying to sort of pan out,
Mm-hmm.
and not really understanding that a lot of that has to be grounded on where we're getting truth first, right? And then we can build up our own sort of perspectives. Whereas if you start with us first and then try and sort out truth to fit in with that, you're going to get poor results.
Well, I mean, this is where, like, my point comes again to, and I find it profound. I've heard many people say, "Doug, don't give that point again." But it's that idea that we didn't create it. We didn't create us. And yet there's this, to your point, there's this human lens that we see everything through. And it's very difficult not to feel that we're not in control of that. I'm kind of now at the point, believe it or not, Mike, is that this is that kind of free will discussion, right? And
Mm.
whether, like, God created everything, that is biblically, and so that means we're puppets. We don't have control. And this is where I said so much is beyond what we can understand, is I think it's both. I think we actually do choose the kind of coffee we buy at Starbucks. But I also think that the force that created all this created everything. And people will say, well, you can't say that because that doesn't make logical sense. Well, is it supposed to? Where did we say it had to work that way? And this comes to your almost material, the idea of a material science, right? This is the logic that fits into it. Well, who created logic? I think we did.
Yeah, I mean, free will can be a fairly
Oh,
heated
yes.
conversation.
Huge.
But honestly, I think free will is necessary, right? I don't
And
think, like, regardless of how you approach your
yes.
worldview, you need free will. So take science for instance. If you do a scientific method and you get a conclusion, you have to choose that, right?
Hmm.
And we know from experience, people don't always choose that. Sometimes people fabricate results, sometimes people reject the scientific conclusion.
Yes.
And so if that's because, we're unreliable to do science, then all of science goes out the window as reliable. Because we're just doing
Right.
whatever, say, our brains are determining us to do. Sometimes we follow the science, sometimes we don't. But if there's free will, well, then we can say those people just chose not to follow the science, but the
Right.
science is otherwise reliable on whole. And so, yeah, when you're doing science, when you're doing logic, free will is sort of a necessary aspect to it. Um, and I personally don't see any major conflicts. And I mean, I know that's sort of its own rabbit hole,
Right.
with something like theism, but um, I think we can still freely determine things for ourselves, um, and still have, say, an omniscient God in the picture,
Hmm.
right? And he just happens to know what we would freely choose, right? And I
Hmm.
mean, how you figure that out time-wise and all of that stuff, that's difficult, I understand. But like you said, I think there's room, and I think you can hold on to those beliefs without having an explanation in hand right now, because it is necessary.
I, I I like how you say it because it is necessary. I actually think we need to have free will purely to be civilized. Because if we didn't have the ability to control our actions and believe that we did, how can you be penalized for doing something that's immoral or illegal? Like you
Yeah,
couldn't have like, well, I plead that I didn't do that. I just decided that that was, and it's not in my control anyway. So how can you incarcerate me for this? Like, and that's a long time ago. So that's to me why I'm beginning to become more comfortable with both because it's like you've said it already with regards to even the idea from a science perspective, but I think there's just too many things that don't work. And I'll go back to C.S. Lewis, who I think made the statement that we can actually definitively never really know. So let's put it on the table, put it on the shelf, and move on. He
yeah,
did it much more eloquently than that, but that's kind of what I took from it is that because it's been debated forever, I think, right? Since we could actually speak.
yeah. Well, and I think it also depends what you mean by no, right? If you're talking absolute certainty in something,
Yes.
well, if you want to go down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
do we have absolute certainty in anything?
Oh,
Or are we just brains in a vat being fed the simulation, right?
yes,
And
yes, yes.
therefore not real. But yeah, I think there is some truth in that, and understanding again where the limits of epistemology are, right, and what we can know and how we can know it. If nothing else, is fairly humbling and sobering.
Well, it's funny because I think it was actually Dr. Christopher Wright that I was talking to, and he said about the myth of human progress. And he was saying because we don't really we haven't really changed like in 2000 years because we have like literally the same emotions that we always had, right? Technologically, yes, we've shifted a lot, but is that human progress is the question, right? And I thought it was like I didn't I didn't unpack it fully, but I hadn't really thought of it in that manner before of this whole myth of human progress. Like because you think today even um you hear often well even Andy Steiger said this at the beginning of the apologetics cover. We're not supposed to be alone. We're in this epidemic of loneliness, right? Um, and how does that fit in to like that's not really progress, is it? And then he pulled out a line from Genesis 2:18 where he says man is not supposed to be alone. And I couldn't believe actually, Mike, that I'd never kind of that had never registered with me. Like, this is the second verse in Genesis. And the reason I think why is because followed by a semicolon, it says, I will make you a helper. We hear the helper part. I don't remember hearing that we're not supposed to be alone. And yet, so is that true? We've got our iPhones, we've got all our technology today, we've got our AI, but yet we're experiencing this epidemic of loneliness.
Yeah. So as the academic, or
Yes,
as an academic, I want to define terms. So what do we mean by progress, right? And so if you talk about
absolutely.
progress scientifically, sure, right? But
Yep.
I think you are touching on a good point here, that we use progress as sort of a wide-ranging term
Mm,
for human change, or
mm,
human society in general.
yes.
And it isn't always progress, right? And I mean, there are some
Mhm.
things you can point to, and we've definitely come a long way
Oh
in
yeah,
some
absolutely.
respects.
Yes.
So, um, but yeah, I think there's also things that we haven't progressed, like you said, with loneliness. Um, I'd also say, in terms of on sort of the same thought, just socially, right? I think
Oh
socially
yes.
we've degraded, which has resulted in the loneliness.
Yes.
And our advanced technology has played a big part in that, right? And
Yep.
being able to get updates on family without having to talk to family,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
That's changed things.
Yes. Enormously, right? I mean, we look for pictures on Facebook to see what everybody's doing rather than actually going out and seeing them, as an example.
Yeah.
We in many ways know, we seemingly know what people are doing when we see them on Facebook. But the part that I find always interesting is the, what a picture tells you is what you see, but it's like the big vacation picture that you get, that you see, right? Everybody's smiling at the camera, but no one talks about the car that broke down and the fact that the air conditioning is not working at the room that we rented, nor the water, and two of us have been sick because of the food we ate, right? Like, it's,
Yeah.
you don't get that out of a picture, but yet, to your point, socially that's becoming very acceptable to understand that's where everybody's at.
Well, and it's also changed the behavior of people behind the camera, because they know that, and so the picture becomes everything. And so,
Yes.
they'll stage the picture to present a certain truth about, their vacation or whatever it is.
Oh,
But
that's another one.
the resort's on fire behind the camera or whatever it might be.
Right.
So yeah, and I think, again, going full loop back to this idea of truth, we're
Mhm.
changing that too because of the technology and our human experience.
Well, the other part that I see in this, and this comes back to science, and that's the second law of thermodynamics. As time goes on, the more disorder we see, right? And is that kind of what we're experiencing in this existence? Is it just the fact that there's more and more disorder all the time, right? Some of it we try to, like, we're the disorder busters as humans, right? Because we're trying to organize things. But I sometimes wonder whether this is very much just a natural progression of how we humans, I'll use the word evolve, so to speak.
To some extent, maybe. Um, I probably wouldn't connect it to the second law, um, partially because, I mean, the second law is usually, like, it's very common to describe it as sort of order becoming disorder, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
But at its core, it's more statistical, right? And it's more that the
Mhm.
number of ways we can sort of configure the system is growing constantly, right? There's more options for the
Right.
way something can be. For humans, I don't think that's necessarily the problem, but
Okay.
because, I mean, you can look at some societies that existed fairly long term, and I mean, they'll have their change, but they also lived, reasonably in the same way,
Hmm.
right? So I mean,
Hmm.
there's these isolated communities in, say, the
Yes.
Amazon, and they've probably
Yep.
been living that way for centuries or even millennia. And so I think humans can do that, but I think what we're seeing is a limit of humans for dealing with large amounts of, say, information and input, right? Something we're not really designed for.
Right. Right.
And so, yeah, I'm not sure it's so much order disorder, but we're running into human limits that simply weren't exposed before because we didn't have the technology to make that happen.
Right. Do you think that is, when you say that, I just think of my phone, and just in even the last 5 years, how much that what I do on my phone has changed. Like how much more time I actually spend on my phone doing things that apps require, doing this podcast, doing, like, there's just so many interactions that have begun. Like, is it something, do you think that our minds will evolve around, or no? To
I
be able to
don't,
consume more of that.
I honestly don't know. Um, that's probably a little out of my wheelhouse,
Yes, for
but
sure. Yes.
I mean, humans are very adaptable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we
Good
have
point.
quite a bit of room
Good
to
point.
adapt for that.
Yeah.
But we also have our limits, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if you look at, say, the spike of mental illness as well, right?
Mm.
And I think
Yes.
that's partially our minds hitting the limits.
Okay. That's interesting.
But long term, will society adapt, right? I don't know. Um,
Mm.
but I mean, it's interesting because, yeah, you're right. We are being pushed more and more towards our phones. And there's sort of a business aspect to that too. Like companies are trying to make money, right? They're trying to get data from
Absolutely.
you.
Yep.
And so, I've never been a big phone user myself. And, somebody who's really into technology, you'd think I'd be
Yes.
on my phone all the time, but I don't know why. That's never really been a huge issue for me. But I find myself needing to do more and more things there. Just like my banking website won't allow me to do one thing, but the banking app will. It's like,
Yes. Yep. Yep.
yeah,
Because it's all being developed first for our phones,
right.
I think. So, yeah, I mean, I'm similar in that sense to you. I've not been a big phone user, but I've just found that it's becoming, well, partly because many of the applications that I use, they're offering more on your phone than they are on your laptop, right? And it's like, because it's being more quickly developed for that area, I think. So I'm intrigued by it. Like, it's fun to observe it, and I think that's why I'm asking you, because you're in a different community than I would be, and it's interesting to see how that kind of connects with overall the thinking and where that's going to go. I'm intrigued by that. It's
So, yeah, so I mean, going back to the human condition thing, just
yes,
occurred to me
yes,
is humans tend to like the easy option, right? They like things easy. And so if the phone
yes,
app is easier, they'll use it.
yeah,
But we also see this with, academics and cheating, right? If cheating's
okay,
easier,
yes,
then
yes,
then
absolutely,
that's what they'll do. Um, or things like copyright and pirating. If pirating's easier, that's what people tend to do.
yep.
There's been studies on that. So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting how much the human element is important to all of these conversations. I think is just what I wanted to point out there
Yeah, no,
is
it's very true. This is why, to me, the psychology part of it becomes increasingly fascinating, because it's this came up the other night in a conversation. It's like marketing, which is a full part of psychology, and marketing is really about trying to convince you that your life's not good enough the way it is,
yeah,
which is not particularly altruistic in the sense of what it literally abounds around us, right? Whether we're picking up a phone, whether we're picking our laptop, whatever it is, it's like kind of everywhere. And to your point, the human experience in this, how we get to adapt to that is because you could say, well, I'll just ignore it all. I just don't think that's an answer. I just don't like, we can't all be hermits in a forest, so to speak. In fact, if anything, and I have you seen this? I talk about this a lot. The series Alone.
yes, yeah.
So I've laughed this because originally my wife saw it and says, let's watch it. And I had no interest in it, Mike, at all. I didn't want to even watch the first episode.
That was me too. I do not like reality TV.
And then I watched the first episode. And I watched another, and I'm watching, and I'm going like these. They're so the concept for people listening is alone. You got 10 people, and they dump them primarily in northern isolated Canada, and you're alone. And the person who can be alone the longest without having to pull the bell wins. That's the concept of it. And like after 30 days, even less, we've got these Navy SEAL trained men who are weeping in front of, because they're all filmed, right? For missing their kids and missing their wives. And like you're going like, aren't you trained not to do this? Like it's kind of an unbelievable, and you kind of think, well, if you're in prison or incarcerated for something bad and you do something bad even in prison, where do you go? They lock you up in solitary, apparently, right? Make it worse. And it's kind of the human experience, Mike. This is what, like, it almost seems like technology drives us to be alone because we think we're with people when we're looking at our screens, and we're actually not.
But it's easier, right?
It's absolutely easier. It's like this is the pandemic has kind of demonstrated this to me. I'm finding this interesting when I'm talking to you originally about quantum gravity, and we're on to the human
Yeah,
experience.
conversations taking a few twists.
But it's one of like the pandemic really kind of locked us up in our houses, right? What a great time for the tech world to develop their apps to get us entertained. But, and then to your point about being easier, now it seems to be a much bigger effort to go and invite a person out to go for coffee because I got to do something. Like, does anybody go to the movies anymore? You could stream everything on your television set, and I don't have to move. In fact, I don't even have to move to get food because I can have Skipped Edition delivered right to my doorstep. And I think what's kind of starting to come about to me, and this is part of even why I started Better Than Not. I don't think we have any idea, Mike, of how bad we need each other.
Yeah, no, I agree. Um, though I
I'm
would
floored by it, but
though I would say
I,
with the pandemic, I think people are starting to realize that.
hmm,
And maybe they haven't connected all the dots, but people are realizing that being isolated is not good for your mental health, right? And I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily resulted in change, but there is a lot of talk about that wasn't there pre-pandemic.
hmm. Now, when you say talk, is that talk of talking to colleagues, talking to people in the world, the communities that you interface with? Is this talk on media channels that you hear? Like, where does that come from for your information?
I'd say all, like overall.
Okay, okay, yeah,
Um, Not that it's necessarily like a massive, topic that everyone's discussing, but I've
right.
heard it, across the board and to some extent.
Well, this came up in a previous podcast, but I was also talking about our transactional society, that I can't talk to you unless I can offer you something.
Mm,
I can't go to coffee with you unless I have something of value that I can offer you. Versus, well, I just want to go to coffee with you because I would like to talk to somebody about anything, right? And I think our world has been very transactional, and I'm hoping that that's another thing that we become more aware of, is that we just want to be with people, like 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 having a conversation, not necessarily about with any, shall we say, intent. The only intent being inviting a person out to have coffee or doing that part of it, right?
hmm
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I think we've lost a lot of the places where that would happen
Mm-mm.
naturally.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Um, Especially with, people pulling away from church.
Yes. Yes.
And even today, I'd say people are less inclined to say go out to lunch after church and then just talk about, the sermon or whatever, or, stand around for an hour or two after and have conversations. Like you were saying, it's very transactional. People have other things to do,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah.
Well, my experience in moving out to Abbotsford has been kind of exactly that. So where the conference for the Apologetics Canada, where I met you at, is the Northview campus or the Northview Church here in Abbotsford. We go to a satellite one called Central Abbey, and after they actually serve a dinner prior to the service, and then after the service you can go for dessert, and it's on Saturday night. And I'll tell you, Mike, it's kind of that boots on the ground experience for me has blown my mind. Like I look forward to it. Like like not because I think I'm like, well, I got to do this and this and this to to the transactional hours, but it's just being with people and talking about it. And it's like it becomes so aware. And my life has not been that way. This is like a fairly last 5 years kind of thing that has been like, we need this. Or I started with, I need this. And then I started to think, well, maybe I'm not the only one that does.
Well, and I think maybe that's why the pandemic, it's, in my opinion,
Mm.
started shifting things and brought some awareness to it because, if you have a bit of isolation, maybe you can cope. But when
Right.
you have complete isolation, you suddenly realize how bad
Yep.
that is for you.
Yep. No, it's to me, this is why this Alone series has kind of blown my mind, because I didn't anticipate what um people how we react to that. That's what I didn't anticipate. Like I didn't think it would be like that. And then I find it being very personal as well in moving from my experience is moving from the corporate world into kind of a writing full-time role, and realizing I can't just be by myself all the time. I have to be communicating, talking to other human beings.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's really important as academics too, right?
Oh,
Because I mean, that's
yes.
how we learn. That's how we improve, our ideas and our research and stuff.
Yep,
And
absolutely.
um, I think there was a lot of the sentiment too, just from teaching. Because if you have to teach remotely, it's a very different
Oh,
experience from
oh
teaching in
yeah.
person. So, and there's a humanizing aspect too. Like students treat you different if you're just sort of a voice on a video screen versus somebody in front of them that they can
Yes.
have, a conversation with. So,
No, well, it's funny because we started doing this Better Than Not podcast via this. So here we're talking about it and we're talking to each other on a screen. And I found now doing in person, just it's a whole nother level of kind of communication that's nonverbal in many ways, that leads to verbal, but it's something that I just wasn't aware of. I'm glad I'm becoming aware of it, because it's really very much changing, I think, um, how humans could interact, how I've looked at interacting, and can that help others in the same sense, in promoting that type of thing, right?
yeah,
So
no, I think it's very valuable. And I mean, if you look at some of the big podcasts in the world, like Joe
yes,
Rogan, always in person, right?
yep, yep. I was going to say, because they struggled, not struggled, but he commented on that even when they had to shut down and they had to have, because people couldn't travel, right?
Right.
So it's like there is that part that we do, like I said, need each other. And for me, that's been an enormous, I'll call it, surprise, that feels good when you can actually do it, though. That's the difference. So
Yeah, it's nice. I mean, the technology is great when the option isn't there, right? And
right.
it like everything, balance and, knowing when it has its role. But
No, no, that's very cool. Mike, I've taken a lot of your afternoon away, but
that's
this has been
okay.
a spectacular conversation to me. But before we go, is there anything that we've crossed a lot of lines here, but is there anything that you'd like to that we didn't talk about that you would like to maybe add or kind of end with, or
I think the only thing I'd mention is that, I don't think, Christians or people who are just sort of exploring, like you said, spiritual ideas and things like that, there's nothing to be afraid of in the science, right? There,
Mm,
there is room
mm,
for both parts in a worldview. And in many ways, like we were talking about before, they're sort of required for each other too.
yes.
Um, so yeah, there's nothing to be afraid of in the science, right? And if you have scientific questions, you don't need to be afraid of what the answer will be. Um, even I wouldn't be afraid of challenging, your worldview, because ultimately, at least as Christians, whatever the truth is going to align with our Christianity, right? Because
Hmm.
we serve the truth,
Right, right.
right? And so, I think from that perspective, we should be embracing science, and just just for people to know that there is room for both, and they don't have to be put into their own corners.
I think, Mike, that is such a great way to end, because I think that's an important part of this overall discussion. Is it's not one or the other. It's both, and one stems from the other, and one can in both ways can help to really improve the experience, the learning, and the understanding of it all overall. So that's a perfect way to end. I really like that. So
Good.
again, if someone was interested in getting in touch with you, how do you have a way of I guess they could reach you through the Apologetics Canada website?
That's the easiest way right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And with that, I was going to say, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have, because this is one of the ones that I'd like to do a lot more often. Talking with people like Mike, who are scientists and they work in the science world. It's not the world as Mike has described it. It's not as always the way we hear about it. It's not always quite how it's looked. And with that idea of balance, but one needs the other, like to get us a full understanding of what this human experience is all about. And I thank you for joining us on Better Than Not. And I hope you've, like I said, enjoyed this episode with Dr. Michael Butler.
Thank
Bye
you for
for now,
having me.
Mike. Great on.
Are we on? Good. Welcome to the Better Than Not podcast. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But when we at least do something, we know it's almost always better than not.